we will be comparing 3 other vehicles, 3 other tier 8 medium tanks to this tank, and we will see what kind of speciality this tank has to offer for the player and the one who bought this tank actually. So let's take a look at all the statistics. First of all, we're going to be comparing it to the T34/3, the T54 Mod 1, and the M46 Korea. Why are we comparing it to these 3 vehicles? Well, first of all, the M46 Korea is another American tier 8 medium tank, actually a premium that we'll be covering very soon. And obviously we have to compare another American vehicle to an American tier 8 medium tank. The T54 Mod 1 has very similar statistics in armor, but varies very differently in mobility and at the same time gun handling. The T34-3 is a Chinese tank that has decent armor, much better mobility than T26E4, and a very different gun. So let's take a look at the firepower. The T26E4 and the M46 Korea both are equipped with a 90mm gun, thus they have the same amount of penetration, 192mm, and the same amount of alpha damage, 240. Now the 192mm of alpha of penetration at tier 8 is actually a viable option. It's not too bad, especially if you compare it to the T34-3 with 175mm of pen, but with 390 alpha damage. 192 is enough to work through a lot of other tier 8 tanks, especially if you have their side and their weak spots, and is actually fairly nice if you ask me. Rate of fire is also the best on the T26E4. Keep in mind, I own all 4 of these tanks, I have all the different crews, and I have the best crew on the T26E4. That gives me the best rate of fire. Turret traverse, on the other hand, is not as potent as other tanks, for example the M46 Korea, which is almost, well, 14 degrees per second faster than the E4, and the T54 Mod 1 with 41 degrees per second, which is 15 degrees per second faster, and the T34/3 pretty much almost double the speed that you have with this tank. So you can see the armor does cost you a little bit of the flexibility that some other medium tanks do have. Moving on, gun elevation and depression. 10 degrees of gun elevation is the best, 10 degrees of gun depression, 20 degrees of gun elevation is the best in regards of all the 3 other tanks. Same with the M46, and gives you the option of cresting these ridges and the hills, and allows you a lot of flexibility. Aim time is the best on the T26E4, which ties its first spot with the T54 Mod 1. And you can see that dispersion at 0.35 is actually not too bad. It could be better, but at least it's a lot better than the T34-3, and the DPM is almost identical to the T54 Mod 1. Moving on to survivability. Keep in mind, this is a medium tank that has 1,500 hit points. That is the standard average damage of, I think, a heavy tank. If we keep in mind the FCM F1 has 1,500 hit points as well. And this tank has 101mm of frontal armor and 76mm of side armor. What is so special about the frontal armor of the T26, you're asking? Well, it does have this huge shield in front, which makes it a lot stronger, and the angle at the same time makes it a lot harder to penetrate because it's a nice flat angle. The 101mm of armor is actually just the armor underneath it. You get the additional armor on the front with this armor plate, and then you get the angle as well. So penetrating the front part of the turret, the hull, is rather tricky at tier 8. At tier 9 it's getting a little bit easier, and at tier 10, well, it's no danger at all. This tank can face tier 10 tanks, keep that in mind. It's not too nice to face tier 9 and tier 10 tanks in a tier 8 vehicle, but that's the life of a World of Tanks player, right? Lower plate is fairly sturdy as well, but going up against those premium rounds and these stronger tier 9 and tier 10 opponents will really cost you, I think, a lot of hit points. They can penetrate the lower plate, but we'll get to that later on. Moving on with survivability, as we go on to the statistics. 101 millimeters of frontal turret armor, 76 millimeters of side turret armor, and 76 millimeters on the rear turret armor. You can see the stats are not as good as on the T54 Mod 1. The armor on the T34 is also a lot better. These Chinese and Soviet tanks most of the time do have much better frontal turret armor, much better side armor. It's just the design of the turret is very, very different from the American design. The M46 Korea does have the worst statistics here. It's a very, very weak turret, and it gets penetrated quite easily. What does this have to do with the T26E4? Is it on the category of very, very strong turret, or is it more on the side of, well, let's not talk about it because it's going to frustrate you. Just thinking about it is going to make you hurl. Well, it is much rather in the second category. The turret, although at the front is fairly sturdy, the gun mantlet is additionally thick with the nice armor wield that you have in the front, the shield that gives you additional protection, but the side of the turret is rather weak. You can shoot through it if you have an angle. Then you have to do huge cupolas on top, which are not additionally armored, and they're really weak. And the same goes for the top part of the turret right here. This entire area is a huge weak spot and a huge problem for this tank. Thus, it makes it a little bit more balanced to go up against, because this tank has a very rich and long history of being too strong, too weak, too strong, right in the middle, then a little bit too weak again, and then being buffed a little bit to be just right in the right position. And it has a very long history of buffs and nerfs. Moving on from survivability to mobility. Having that much frontal armor is going to cost you in mobility, right? Well, yes and no. It's not as bad as it could be. 40 kilometers going forwards and 18 kilometers going backwards. It's obviously not as good as the T54 Mod 1, which has 44 kilometers going forward, and not as good as the T34, which is the most mobile tank right here. The traverse speed, on the other hand, is decent regarding the weight of the vehicle, which is at 53 tons, and, well, pretty damn heavy, especially considering the weights of the T34 and the 54. So it could have been worse. It's decent, and it will get you around the map quite easily. Concealment and spotting obviously are different kind of statistics that we're not going to be covering because they do stem from the equipment and the crew skill that you have. So what does this leave us with? It leaves us with a tank that has a decent gun, very good armor in certain situations, and decent armor in the worst situation. So all in all, decent mobility. It sounds like a tank that might be easy enough to play for a lot of people, not to get frustrated, and to have some good games and be played remarkably well in the hands of a very capable player. And that's exactly what the T26E4 is. After the buffs of the pen to 192mm, it has become a lot more flexible than previously. And the armor, although not entirely 100% efficient against tier 9s and tier 10s, does give you the nice little boost that you need against these tier 8s, and can be quite nice and reliable in a lot of situations. So, talking about the T26E4 does sound like it's a decent kind of tank. That's exactly what we're going to try and figure out. Let's see how this tank does fare out in the battlefield. I've prepared two games for you guys. One where you can see the limitations of the vehicle, and the other where you can see what it is capable of. And before we start off this gameplay right here, I kind of forgot to mention two things. This tank is getting preferential matchmaking. What does that mean? You will only meet tier 9 vehicles max, no tier 10 tanks. That's it. I kind of forgot that. Keep that in mind. Only tier 9 vehicles. That's a huge difference. Second, ground resistance are not that great. The stats for ground resistance. Your vehicle does not accelerate fast enough to reach the 40-kilometer mark, and it certainly is not one of those fast medium tanks, but still, it's mobile enough, it's decent enough to get around the map. And a map like this, in a matchup like this, against tier 6 vehicles, and just a few other tier 8, in a city map where you can use your armor effectively, this tank should shine. And you are right and wrong at the same time, because the thing about this tank is that it only has armor in one very specific spot, and that's the front. It's not very well armored on the side or on the rear like any other tank. That's obviously not what the tank designers had in mind, because they needed to face the tanks up front. It was supposed to be flanked, this vehicle, right? And you can just see how well it does against these tier 6 tanks, right? Brawling with the additional armor that you have, and the rate of fire, which is really, really brutal, coupled with the 192 millimeters of pen, gives you a very nice opportunity and a very nice basis to play against these lower tiers and same tier opponents, right? It doesn't excel at anything, really. This is a vehicle that's very mediocre, and that's not a bad thing. Mediocrity in this kind of sense is not bad. It's actually a pro of this tank, because it doesn't have the best armor, it doesn't have the best mobility, it's not specialized in something like the Lorraine is. The Lorraine has a great gun, is very fast, but doesn't have any armor. This vehicle, on the other hand, though, has a decent gun that you can work with very well, good armor that you can work with very well against a lot of these tanks, and mobility that can get you around the map without, without being the first to arrive, but still to arrive at times that you can still do something to impact the game. And I think that's not bad. But what you can see right here is that this tank, once overwhelmed, just like any other vehicle, is not going to fare very well. Its limitations basically consists of its armor, its gun, and pretty much anyone who wants to go up against like several vehicles at the same time, because it's just not that armored. It's not that greatly armored. The gun handling is good, but it's not going to be good enough. So this vehicle is going to struggle sometimes in certain situations where you might need a very specific tank for the role, a very specialized vehicle for flanking, for example, the Lorraine 40T. And I think this is the biggest backdrop to this tank, because it cannot fulfill every role. It can be set in for every role, but it cannot efficiently fulfill every role, if that makes any sense. It's very difficult to explain, because it is a good all-rounder. It's a great foundation tank, in my opinion. People who have never played medium tanks and who've played a lot of heavy tanks can really get used to this tank, because it plays similarly to a heavy, but at the same time has the medium tank, medium tank characteristics, and these are combined together, and it combines, a little bit of that and a little bit of that, and it isn't the best at a lot of things, but it's good at a lot of things, and that is going to help you win a lot of matches, and it's going to be a lot simpler and a lot more satisfying to play the tank, because you already know a little bit about the vehicle. You might need to learn a little bit about the heavy tank part of the vehicle if you have never played heavies, but you can get into that very quickly, because it combines that. But it's not going to be a pure heavy, so you're not going to be bouncing shells all over the place, although you have very, very good armor for a medium tank. That armor is even a little bit better than some other heavy tanks, but at the same time, it still is a medium tank, so you need to get into all the branches. You play this vehicle and you notice that it has all of this combined, and it's decent in all of it, but it's not going to excel in any one of the categories. And that's, I think, the biggest backdrop. But also, it's the foundation of this tank, which gives, you know, the new players a very, very decent vehicle, which they can jump in and have decent games in. For people who have played a lot of games and know how to play Wolf tanks, this can be a very, very good tool. A very, very strong vehicle, which has its limitations, but at the same time can do exceptionally well if you know how to use your armor, if you know how to use your gun, if you know the position that you need to drive to. But it's not going to be like the Lorraine. The Lorraine is a very specialized tank that is going to do extremely well, or it's going to do extremely bad. It's nothing in between, and the T26E4 is exactly what's in between. So, without further ado, let's jump into the second game and see how good mediocre can be. The game that we're going to be taking a look at is on the map Erlenberg, and we are not top tier round. This match around, we're not top tier. We're playing against some tier 9s, but mostly tier 8 vehicles. And in such a matchup, you would be thinking, well, this tank is not going to be as potent as it was in tier 6. And you certainly are right, because you have bigger guns facing you, you have pretty much, I think, more experienced players, people who have played more games than the usual, the standard, the average tier 6 player, and you have tier 9 vehicles with a lot of armor, and even tier 8s with a lot of armor. But is that gonna stop you? If you take a look at the other side, you have a lot more potential damage that you can take. You have more experienced players who can help you out. And overall, you have better support in a lot of situations. So there are always pros and cons, but sometimes the cons outweigh the pros, and sometimes it's vice versa. But talking about the mediocrity of this tank, being in the middle area isn't a bad thing, and I think this tank proves it. And you will see exactly what I talk about in this game. It costs right now, I think, about 7,200 gold pieces, and it has a very rich history of being buffed, nerfed, buffed again, nerfed again, and all over the place with the Wargaming rebalancing hammer. It has been hit by that hammer a few times, and sometimes it was a good change, sometimes it was a bad change. You guys know the rest. But I think right now this tank is in a very good spot. It's not overpowered because it has these weak spots. It's not underpowered because it does still have the armor, which is very, very potent in the right positions. And it does have a gun which is fairly nice now, because you have 192 millimeters of pen, while you previously only had 170 millimeters of pen, which was not good enough. Thus, you had to rely on a lot of premium ammunition. And you can see these tanks obviously do hit a lot harder, but this is a position you want to be in your T26E4. This is a T34 who just put a shell into our top turret, and who is going to try again and bounces off our turret this time around. Why? Because he shot my gun mantlet, and that is protected by an additional armor shield, and this is exactly what you want your enemy tank to shoot at. The strong parts of your tank. You want to lure them into shooting your hull, into your front part of the turret, not at your cupola. But at the same time, most of the people know the weak spots of the cupola. They know the weak spot at the machine gun port. But still, every once in a while, you will meet some people who will bounce shells on your tank. And this T95 just bounced a shell off our lower plate right there, and you can see that this is a very, very sturdy lower plate. This is a tier 9 tank that just bounced off a tier 8 premium medium tank. And I think that's exactly the strong point of this vehicle. It's mediocrity with not having the best armor, not having the best gun, really shines right here, because you can still use it to a great effect. And we take out the AMX 5120, and we manage to take over the entire east part of the map. This T95 bounced off of us, and now we are gonna proxy spot him and spot him through the bush, and he cannot do a lot against that. Obviously, the T95 is specialized on armor. We could shoot the lower plate right there, maybe even penetrate, but it's kind of difficult to do that without getting spotted. That's exactly not what I wanted to do. So mobility wise, this tank is not the greatest. Armor wise, it has too many weak spots to be great, but it's very, very efficient if you can hide those weak spots. Gun wise, it has nice pen right now. It has good gun handling. It's not the most accurate tank, but I think you can get around with the 0.35 dispersion at 100 meters. And I think right now it's in a very good state. It's one of the tier 8 medium tanks, one of the tier 8 premiums that I think is balanced right now because it has been around for a while. People know where to shoot it. People have gotten used to it. And I think generally speaking, people have very decent games in this vehicle. And I think it's a great starting tank for newcomers, and it's even a good vehicle for experienced players because it gives you a lot of power, a lot of great foundation, as I mentioned previously a few times, a good foundation that can really be used to excel in certain areas, but has its limitations as well in a few matches, like when you need a fast tank, for example, when you need a vehicle that has high alpha damage. You can have it all, but I'd say it is a very, very balanced tank. It's a lot of fun to play for me, even though I played a few battles in it, and I think it's a lot of fun for the new players as well. It's not going to be as frustrating as the Lorraine, for example. It's going to be a lot more balanced for them, and I think it's overall a very decent buy. It's $30 right now, 7,200 gold. You can pick it up in the in-game store, and I think for a final verdict, this is a very decent tank, a vehicle that I think everyone can get used to. It doesn't have any major weaknesses and doesn't have any major strong points, but that's exactly what this tank is meant to be. It's meant to be in the middle so that people can play it and everyone can enjoy it and have decent games in it. And yeah, that would finish this best premium review of the T26E4. As always, I'd love to hear you guys in the comment section down below what you guys think of this vehicle, and I'll see you guys on the next one.